The sun didn't set over Oakhaven. It bled out, staining the Iowa horizon the color of a rusted blade. Samuel Thornton knelt in the dirt, his knees sinking into the grit he'd swept off his doorstep every morning for 40 years. The air was a thick, oily shroud, smelling of scorched cedar and the chemical sting of melted linoleum. Behind him, the skeletal remains of Thornton's hardware groaned in the cooling air, the blackened beams looking like the ribs of a dead leviathan. The sirens cut through the twilight, a jagged, rhythmic screaming that tore the silence of Main Street to ribbons. "Stand up, Sam." The voice belonged to Sheriff Miller, but it sounded hollow, like wind blowing through an empty grain silo. Miller had been Sam's friend since they were boys catching crawdads in the creek, but now the sheriff wouldn't look him in the eye. He stared instead at the brass buttons of his own uniform, his hands trembling as he reached for the cold steel on his belt. The handcuffs were a bite of ice against Sam's wrists. The metal felt wrong, unnatural against skin that had spent a lifetime calloused by honest timber and iron. "You have the right to remain silent," Miller recited, the words falling like stones into a well. Sam didn't move. He didn't fight. He stood with the heavy-rooted stillness of an old oak, even as the shadows of his neighbors gathered on the sidewalk. These were the people he'd carried through the great drought, the men he'd given credit to when their harvests failed, the women whose kitchen sinks he'd fixed for the price of a thank you. Now they were silhouettes of judgment. He could feel their whispers, a low, buzzing hornet's nest of betrayal. "Arson, Sam, for the insurance." Miller's voice cracked, a flicker of grief escaping his professional mask. "They found the canisters in the back, the accelerant. It's all mapped out." Sam looked at the ash coating his boots, the remains of his father's ledger, his grandfather's workbench, and his own legacy. The injustice was a physical weight, a coat of lead draped over his shoulders. He didn't have the words to fight the lie yet, only the bitter taste of soot on his tongue, and the knowledge that the vultures had finally come home to roost. As they led him to the patrol car, the charred sign of his shop swung above them, creaking on a single hinge, a funeral bell for a man who had lost everything but his silence. The back seat of the patrol car smelled of cheap upholstery and Miller's stale sweat. Outside the window, Oakhaven blurred into a smudge of gray, but Samuel's mind remained anchored in the wreckage. He could still hear the ghost sounds of the shop, the rhythmic thrum-thrum of the floorboards under a heavy boot, the brassy ring of the register, and the sharp, clean scent of fresh-cut cedar that had defined his life. For 40 years, Thornton's hardware had been the town's heartbeat. If a man's roof leaked or his plow snapped, he came to Sam. He'd built his authority not with a badge, but with a handshake that meant something. But the air had changed 6 months ago. It started with Miller dropping by at closing time, his eyes darting toward the ledgers. He'd ask odd, prying questions about property taxes and the burden of an aging building. Then came the men in the charcoal suits, driving cars that cost more than a local farm. They spoke of revitalization and modern footprints, offering a mountain of cash for the corner lot to build a sprawling shopping center. Sam had turned them away, every time. "This land isn't for sale," he'd told them. "It belongs to the dirt it stands on." He remembered the way Miller's face had paled when the developers left for the last time. Rumors had been swirling at the diner, whispers of the sheriff's trips to the riverboat casinos in Council Bluffs, of a debt that was growing like a cancer. Miller needed that development deal. His commission and the finder's fee were the only things that could keep the collectors from breaking his knees. Sam's honesty hadn't just been a virtue, it had become a wall. By refusing to sell, he had inadvertently signed his own death warrant. He realized now that the inspections Miller had insisted on and the upgrades to the back room were just opportunities to plant the canisters. The betrayal sat in Sam's throat like a swallow of lie. He looked at the back of Miller's neck, seeing the frantic pulse beneath the skin. The vultures hadn't just circled, they had set the fire and handed Sam the match. But as the car rattled toward the county jail, Sam's grief began to harden into something colder. They had burned his wood, but they couldn't burn his iron. The bail money had tasted like copper and shame, a life savings drained to buy a temporary reprieve from a concrete cell. When Samuel stepped onto the sidewalk of Main Street, the air didn't feel like freedom, it felt like a vacuum. Oakhaven had turned its back. Mrs. Gable, whose leaky faucet Sam had fixed for free during the winter of '08, saw him coming and abruptly crossed the street, her heels clicking a frantic, uneven rhythm against the pavement. The men outside the feed store, men Sam had played poker with for 20 years, suddenly found something deeply interesting in the dirt beneath their fingernails. They didn't shout, they didn't throw stones, they simply ceased to acknowledge he existed, a quiet erasure that stung worse than a physical blow. He retreated to his house, a Victorian bones and dust structure on the edge of the creek. He turned the heavy deadbolt, the sound echoing through the hollow hallway like a gunshot. The house was a fortress now, or perhaps a tomb. Sam didn't sit in his armchair. He didn't pour a drink. He went to the basement and hauled up a trunk of old papers, the detritus of a lifetime spent in town meetings and civic boredom. The silent grind began under the hum of a single yellow bulb. While the town whispered about his guilt, Sam immersed himself in the geometry of greed. He spread out the old property ledgers and the minutes of the county board of supervisors. His eyes, clouded by age but sharpened by betrayal, began to track the movement of land. It was a slow, agonizing crawl through dry ink and bureaucratic jargon. But then he saw it. A pattern emerged, jagged and ugly as a barbed wire fence. Over the last 5 years, 3 family farms on the outskirts of Oakhaven had been seized for tax irregularities or zoning violations. Each time, the land had been sold for pennies to a shell company out of Des Moines. And at the bottom of every seizure notice, written in a cramped, trembling hand, was the signature of Sheriff Miller. The sheriff wasn't just a debtor, he was a liquidator. Sam leaned back, the leather of his chair groaning. The fire at the hardware store hadn't been an isolated act of desperation. It was the final piece of a map. He looked at the shadows dancing on the wall, his jaw set like a vice. They had tried to bury him in the ash, but they had forgotten that Sam Thornton was a man who knew how to dig. The clock on the mantel struck 2, a hollow metallic sound that felt like a hammer hitting a coffin nail. Samuel sat in the dark, the only light coming from the dying embers in the hearth. The shadows of the room stretched long and distorted, like the fingers of a thief reaching for his throat. A floorboard groaned on the porch, a weight too heavy for the wind. Samuel didn't move. He didn't reach for a gun. He simply sat, his hands resting on his thighs as the front door creaked open. Sheriff Miller stepped into the kitchen, his silhouette framed by the pale moonlight. He smelled of rain and cheap tobacco, a scent that used to mean safety, but now carried the stench of rot. He didn't turn on the lights. He pulled out a chair across from Samuel, the wood scraping against the floor like a serrated blade. "It's over, Sam," Miller whispered. The sheriff's voice was a jagged rasp, thin and desperate. He leaned forward, sliding a single sheet of paper across the table. "Sign the confession. Arson with intent. I've talked to the DA. 5 years, maybe 3 with good behavior. You'll be out before you're 70. Samuel remained a statue of weathered oak. He could hear Miller's breathing, fast, shallow, the frantic rhythm of a man trapped in a burning house of his own making. "If you fight this," Miller hissed, leaning into the darkness, "they'll bury you. They'll take the house, the land, every cent you've got left. Sign it for the sake of your father's name, Sam. Don't let the Thornton legacy end in a courtroom circus." The silence that followed was a physical weight. Samuel looked at the shadow of his old friend, realizing that the man across from him wasn't a lawman anymore. He was a debt-ridden ghost. Truth wasn't a spoken word in Oakhaven. It was a currency, and Miller was bankrupt. "The paper doesn't change the fire, Miller," Samuel said, his voice a low rumble of gravel. "It only changes who holds the match." Miller stood abruptly, the chair nearly toppling. "Have it your way, but the grinding gear doesn't stop for anyone. It'll crush you into the dirt." When the door clicked shut, Samuel didn't exhale. He stood and walked to the wall phone in the hallway. He dialed a number he'd memorized from a folded scrap of paper. "This is Thornton," he said into the receiver. "I need the man from Missouri. Tell him I don't want words. I want the paper trail. Follow the developer's money until it hits a badge. I'm not looking for an apology. I'm looking for a reckoning." The sky over Oakhaven didn't just darken, it bruised, turning a sickly shade of violet and charcoal as the Iowa tempest rolled in from the plains. Thunder rumbled in the distance like the low guttural warning of a chained dog. Samuel Thornton stood on the steps of the county courthouse, his spine as straight as a level. He wore his only suit, a wool charcoal number that smelled of mothballs and a life lived with careful stewardship. Inside the courtroom, the air was stagnant, heavy with the scent of wet floor wax and the nervous sweat of a town waitin' for a hangin'. Sheriff Miller sat at the prosecution table, his fingers drumming a frantic, uneven beat against the wood. He wouldn't look at Sam. He looked at the judge, at the ceiling, at the dust motes dancing in the dim light, anywhere but the eyes of the man he betrayed. "Your Honor," Miller began, his voice cracking like dry timber. "The evidence recovered from the hardware store is conclusive. Accelerant canisters with Mr. Thornton's prints. We move to bypass the preliminary and proceed to trial." The judge, a man whose face was a roadmap of weary creases, turned to Samuel. "Mr. Thornton, do you have anything to offer before I rule?" Samuel didn't rise with haste. He moved with the deliberate weight of iron. He didn't look at the judge. He looked directly at Miller. "I have a story about a gift," Samuel said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that cut through the humidity. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy, gold-cased pocket watch. "Miller gave me this 10 years ago for service to the community," he said. "It's a fine piece of machinery, sturdy, reliable." Miller's face drained of color, turning the gray of a sun-bleached bone. "But you see," Sam continued, "an old hardware man knows that every machine can be modified. I didn't just keep time with this, Miller. I kept a record." Sam pressed a small recessed button on the side of the casing. The courtroom fell into a silence so thick it felt like the bottom of a well. From the watch's tiny speaker came a hiss of static, then the unmistakable, frantic rasp of Miller's voice from the night of the visit. "Sign the confession, Sam. The grinding gear doesn't stop. Follow the developer's money." The recording didn't just play, it echoed, a mechanical ghost testifying in the hollow room. Outside, the tempest finally broke. A crack of lightning illuminated the courtroom, casting Sam's shadow long and jagged across the floor. "The canisters weren't mine, and the debt wasn't mine," Sam said, the watch still ticking in his calloused palm. "The fire started in a badge, not a basement." The sheriff didn't reach for his gun. He simply collapsed back into his chair, a hollow man finally crushed by the weight of the truth he'd tried to burn. Samuel Thornton turned his back on the wreckage, walking toward the doors as the rain began to hammer against the roof like a million silver nails. The hunter was finished. The reckoning had begun. The storm didn't clear the air, it just washed the easy lies into the gutters. When the courtroom doors swung open, the humidity hit Samuel like a wet wool blanket. The high, arched windows of the courthouse flickered with the dying remnants of the lightning, casting long, skeletal shadows across the marble floor. Behind him, the commotion was a muffled roar, the sound of a world overturning. Click-clack. It was a different metal sound this time, not the hollow bite of Sam's handcuffs, but the heavy, authoritative snap of the state police securing Sheriff Miller's wrists.
"The man who had tried to burn a legacy to pay a gambling debt was being let out the side exit, his head bowed, his golden star looking like a piece of tin junk in the dim light." Samuel stepped onto the portico. The rain had slowed to a rhythmic dripping from the stone gargoyles. A crowd had gathered at the base of the steps, the same silhouettes that had stood in the shadows of his burning shop. Old Man Gable stepped forward, his cap crushed in his grease-stained hands. "Sam," he started, his voice thin and trembling with the weight of unearned shame. "We didn't know. The sheriff, he said—" Mrs. Higgins reached out a hand, her eyes rimmed with the red salt of guilt. "Samuel, let us help. We can start a collection. We can rebuild the beams." Samuel didn't stop. He didn't look at him. He didn't offer the comfort of a nod or the sharp edge of a curse. He moved through 'em like a ghost through a graveyard, his boots rhythmic and heavy against the wet pavement. Their apologies were just more wind, and Sam had had enough of storms.
He walked the 3 blocks to Main Street. The town felt smaller now, stripped of its pretension. He reached the blackened footprint of Thornton's hardware. The smell was still there, the bitter, alkaline stench of charred cedar and melted iron. But the air was cooler now. He went to the shed out back, the only structure the fire hadn't swallowed. He reached inside and pulled out a push broom with a worn hickory handle. Sam walked to the edge of the foundation. He didn't look at the sky or the neighbors watching from the sidewalk with bated breath. He simply set the bristles to the concrete and began to sweep. Swoosh, swoosh. He swept the gray ash into neat piles. He swept the shattered glass and the blackened nails. His movements were slow, deliberate, and ancient. It was the Stoic ascent, the refusal to let the world's rot dictate the rhythm of a man's hands. He stood on the threshold where the front door used to be, looking out at the horizon. The clouds were breaking, revealing a sliver of cold, bruised moonlight. Oakhaven would never be the same. The trust had been burned down to the soot. But as Samuel leaned on his broom, his silhouette hard as a mountain against the night, he knew one thing for certain. The vultures had flown, the fire was out, and he was still standing on his own land.